Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Kisselstein, the junior librarian at Central Library's Local History and Genealogy Department. I'm going to ask that you mute yourselves to the end of the presentation when we'll take questions. And I'd like to introduce our speaker, Derrick Pratt. He is the Director of Education and Public Programming at the Erie Canal Museum.
All right, hi. Thanks for having me, Kate, and thanks to the Onondaga Public Library System for hosting me. Excited to be doing this. So, as mentioned, I'm Derrick Pratt, Director of Education at the Erie Canal Museum. And we got everyone on Zoom at the moment, but next time you make it downtown, come on down to the museum. We're only a couple blocks away, 318 Erie Boulevard, and we're open every day from 10 to 4, so check us out. And today we're going to be talking about the history of foodways on the Erie Canal. This presentation dates back to 2021 when I curated the exhibit Erie Eats at the Erie Canal Museum. I was interim curator at the time as well. So let's dive into it. Today on this presentation, to understand it, we're going to need to know the basic answers to these three questions. What is the Erie Canal? What is the Erie Canal Corridor? And what are foodways? I'll start out with probably the easiest one to answer. This is the Erie Canal, running from Lake Erie to Albany. It is the first major transportation route across the Appalachian Mountains, 363 miles long, 571 feet in elevation are overcome by this man-made waterway, and it does that through the use of 83 lift locks. And the Erie Canal still exists today, as we're going to talk about as well. It was owned and operated, still is, by New York State. They initially built it at the time whopping price of a little over $7 million, which will come into play later in the story. Now, broadly speaking, the canal corridor usually is defined as within 25 miles of the Erie Canal. You also notice on this map there's a number of side canals running off of it as well. Those will play a role in this story as well. But the canal corridor is an important kind of concept to know in New York. Still to this day, I believe it is 75% of upstate New York's population lives within that 25-mile radius of the canal. And that's going to be what's most dramatically impacted food-wise by the canal, though we will see this story has national implications. And finally, the last question we had is, what are foodways? Well, they're defined as the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food. Foodways often refer to the intersection of food and culture, traditions, and history. So that's all to say, pretty much anything that food touches, that relates to foodways. So let's start delving into the foodways of the Erie Canal corridor. Well, to understand how the Erie Canal transforms the foodways of New York, we have to look at the foodways before the Erie Canal is built. Here we have a map from 1807 of 1809, excuse me, of New York State, pre-canal. Obviously, people have lived in New York for approximately 10,000 years, and obviously those people had to eat. Eventually, the indigenous people will form the Haudenosaunee Confederacy here throughout what will eventually become the Erie Canal Corridor in upstate New York. Their diet consists primarily of what is pictured here, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash. Really impressive food agricultural system. They're planted in mounds together. These 3 vegetables, and they have an interesting symbiotic relationship where the corn grows straight and tall. It acts as kind of a bean pole for the beans. The beans replenish nitrogen in the soil, which the corn and squash really suck up a lot of. And then the squash grows at the base, and its their large, broad leaves kind of guard the roots of the other plants, also trap in moisture and keep pests out. So it's a pretty incredible system. It's augmented by hunting and fishing throughout upstate New York. And in large part, traditional Haudenosaunee dishes are stews, soups, and like roasted meats. In the 1600s is when we start seeing first Dutch colonists head up the Mohawk River Valley into what's going to be the Canal Corridor, followed by German and English settler colonialists as well. They're going to bring new foodways into the area, introducing things like livestock, so, chicken, cows, pigs, etc., and new plants, most notably wheat. Though these settlers will learn from the Haudenosaunee things like how to plant corn and beans, which will become important staples of their diet as well. And yeah, similarly, the Haudenosaunee will adopt many of the new food products that Europeans bring with them. Now, like I said, both cultures practice agriculture. Also, I should mention that the European colonists moving into this region, they have very similar styles of food, soups, stews, and roasted meats. There is not particularly advanced food technology, so you're limited, no matter what your culture, you're mainly just limited by what ingredients you have, but you're kind of making the same stuff for the most part. It's also different, if that makes sense. But anyway, both societies are largely agricultural societies. However, the Europeans bring with them the desire to produce for markets. However, they're stymied by the relatively poor transportation networks and sparse population for markets of upstate New York. So largely, if you're a colonial farm in the Mohawk River Valley, you're producing largely just for yourself and your family. Shipping goods anywhere farther than Albany is prohibitively expensive, which is an important thing to note. The Revolution comes, and in 1779, you have the Sullivan-Clinton campaign ordered by George Washington. James Clinton and John Sullivan will lead a large force into the Finger Lakes in the hope of wiping out the Haudenosaunee, largely through attacking their food supplies. Hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn will be burnt in this, as well as a number of towns attacked. Some estimates have over half of the Haudenosaunee population being killed either in this or due to starvation, and many more will flee to the Niagara River, where British garrisons have supplies for them. This is important to the story because it's going to, quote unquote, clear the land for new settlers who are going to move into these relatively fertile lands of central New York and the Finger Lakes after the Revolution. One such person who will move in after the Revolution is this guy. This is Jesse Hawley, who is very important in the canal story, and his story relates directly to the production of food. Hawley, originally from Connecticut, moved to the Seneca River area, and his idea was to kind of get all the grain from around Seneca Lake, have it all get shipped to Geneva. They'd mill it in Seneca Falls, and then you could ship it hopefully in large enough bulk quantities that would be profitable in Eastern markets. This was not the best plan, as will be evidenced by Jesse Hawley going to jail in Canandaigua to debtor's prison after his grain business goes bankrupt. So he's sitting there in the Canandaigua debtor's prison in 1807, kind of stewing over what went wrong for him. And his business determines that the reason why grain export can't happen well in New York is because of poor transportation systems. So he writes his famous Hercules essays, which are incredibly influential in 1807. These propose an artificial waterway or a canal from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. And thus, these essays get into the hands of a number of important figures. 10 years later, they're going to start digging the Erie Canal. And food plays a crucial role in that as well. So digging a canal is hard, back-breaking labor for the most part, manual labor. And this is also being built on the frontier, so there's not banks readily available to pay workers with money. The way New York State kind of gets the job done is they hire contractors whose job is to then hire enough workers to build the canal. Those contractors are usually pretty cash poor, so instead they will largely pay their workers in room and board. So in addition to having a place to sleep, they are also going to provide them with all of their meals, as well as copious amounts of whiskey as well. That is what the majority of a canal worker's pay is, digging the canal. Those contractors are also required to kind of hire the logistical support to do that. Now, they not only have to build a canal, but they have to feed and house their workers. So they will also employ a number of people to do not just what's pictured here, the digging work, but kind of to help out at camp. Those will primarily be women, children. Here we see pictured a really interesting artifact in our collection. This is the kettle of Christine Davis. This picture does not do it justice. I've got to put something to add scale to it. But this is about a 3-foot in diameter kettle. Christine Davis, her husband, dug the Erie Canal, and she in turn was a cook for their work gang that helped build the canal. And this is a really impressive piece in our collection. It's one of the few things we have from the actual digging of the Erie. After they build the Erie Canal, America is swept by what's called canal mania, and the Davises actually keep moving on. So this kettle was used to help dig a number of different canals and feed these canal workers before they finally moved to Arkansas, where it remained until, I believe, 2015, when the Davis family finally donated it to us. Also, an important aspect we should look at during the digging of the canal is the fact that in this time period, slavery still existed in New York. In the 1810 census, it was estimated that 1 in 3 rural New York households had an enslaved person working in them. They were primarily doing things related to food, be it either agricultural work or domestic work like cooking and serving food. One such person we kind of meet in this role at this time period is this gentleman. This is the Reverend Thomas James, born enslaved in Canajoharie, New York, in either 1803 or 1804. He worked primarily during his enslavement doing farming. In fact, at one point, he ends up being exchanged for farm goods shortly before the Erie Canal begins construction in the area. When the canal starts being built, James saw his opportunity and actually would follow the path of the canal as it was being dug all the way to Lockport. Then he crossed the Niagara River into Canada, helped build the Welland Canal, Canada's answer to the Erie, and then actually came back to the new canal boomtown of Rochester, where he found work in a flour mill and warehouse. We're going to talk a bit more about those soon. Worked his way up to being head of their entire freight operation before leaving to become a prominent abolitionist minister. He actually founded Syracuse's A&E Zion Church. And pretty interesting guy, Thomas James, overall. But it also shows us, again, the importance of the institution of slavery at this time period in the foodways of New York. But all that said, the Erie Canal is built between 1817 and 1825, and its impacts are immediately felt, especially right here in Syracuse, where the canal is actually completed here first. It's opened between Utica and Montezuma on the Seneca River in 1820, and Syracuse becomes kind of one of the canal's first boomtowns. Up here in the corner, we can see why. Syracuse will rapidly develop into the Salt City. By the mid-1800s, about 70 to 80% of the nation's salt will be produced here in Syracuse. And the Erie Canal is so important to its manufacture because salt's this bulk commodity, and this is important to note for everything. It's this staple good. You buy it pretty cheaply, salt, which means you have to reduce your transportation costs dramatically for it to be profitable. You have to pretty much get rid of as many overhead prices as you can for it to be competitive on the market. And the Erie Canal will transform transportation in New York. It previously took a month to go from Buffalo to New York City, and probably cost about $100 to transport a ton of goods, well, specifically wheat, that distance. Now, that same journey takes a week or even less, and it costs less than $10 to ship the same amount of goods. So transportation costs have gone down dramatically, as has time. Therefore, the salt industry is able to boom. Also, new industries start to grow up along the canal to service these now thousands of travelers, notably the hotel business. We see here in the lower corner, the Syracuse House, Syracuse's premier hotel for kind of its first 30 to 40 years. And this is an era before restaurants are really popular or well known, but these hotels are kind of where our modern conception of a restaurant starts being born. In the lower halls, they will serve food there. And every little town has its own hotel inn tavern of some sort where people can stay traveling along the canal. It's incredible. I'm from Chitmango, and Bolivar's not even a place that shows up on a map anymore, but it used to have its own hotel. Right? Now, another interesting thing that happens. So for all of the great reductions in travel time brought about by the Erie Canal, one of the many transformative impacts the Erie Canal has on America is it gives us the great tradition of traffic jams. Those 83 lift locks we talked about, those can only take one boat at a time. I mean, they double them up so you can have one boat going up and one going down, but still, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for one boat to lock through. Therefore, if you've got a few boats coming through at the same time, it's going to take a while. We have accounts towards the end of the season when everyone's rushing to do their last run. You've got 12-hour plus traffic jams at some of the busier locks waiting to get through. So that gives you some time to get off of your canal boat, and alongside locks will spring up a lot of what we see here. This is a grocery store. grocery stores, serve the same purpose as they do today. You can buy food at them. So they did have alternate uses back then. Largely, groceries were where you would go to buy alcohol as well. Board canalers took full advantage of that extra feature of the grocery store. So roughs become kind of notorious places. You'll also notice in this picture, oats and hay are also available at the grocery. There is going to be a large industry that springs up all along the canal to feed the mules and horses that will pull canal boats as well. That should be mentioned. But we really see the transformative effects of the Erie Canal best in its first kind of 20 to 30 years here in Rochester, New York. Kind of a perfect storm occurs that allow us to see just how transformative the Erie Canal was. Rochester sits perched on the Genesee River right above the high falls of the Genesee. Before, it had been pretty hard to get to the Genesee River and ship things from there. But the Erie Canal now comes through, and the Genesee is this incredibly fertile valley. And you still go there today, and there's tons of corn and wheat being grown there. It's incredible, really, to see. And Rochester's in this perfect place. It has this now cheap transportation. It has this incredibly fertile valley to its south that's growing just tons and tons of wheat. And it has the high falls, which are able to power its mills. Rochester will quickly become the canal's first true boom town. Some believe that the term boom town is literally coined to describe Rochester because it just explodes. In the 1830s and 1840s census, you see 400% population growth. Rochester is really going to become America's grain flour capital. The Genesee Valley is America's breadbasket for kind of a whole generation. The prices of American flour will be set by what the prices are in Rochester. 25,000 bushels of wheat are ground in a day at Rochester's peak. And it becomes known as the Flour, Flour city. And you can see the importance of the Erie Canal. You've got these mills right here, right next to the canal. So you can easily grind up your flour, toss it onto a canal boat, and it's ready to go. However, its status as a flour city is going to be contested soon. Because, like I said, this is not just a New York State story. The canal has opened up all of the waterways connected to the upper Great Lakes. And people start moving that way. Now that there's easy transportation, you've got these folks on the East Coast, they start heading west and settling along the Great Lakes states, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois. As you'll notice on this map, most of those states are farther south than New York. So they've got longer growing seasons. They also are not nearly as hilly as New York or as rocky. They've got better soil. So, it's going to take kind of a whole generation, 20 or so years to move for people to start settling these areas and developing their farms. But eventually, places like Ohio and Indiana are going to be better at producing wheat, which is bad news for those folks in the Genesee Valley who were previously producing all of that wheat. They are getting outpriced in the marketplace. Wheat production starts dying in New York around kind of the 1850s. However, New York farmers, they see this trend and they adapt to it. They don't just throw up their hands and give up. Instead, they will transition to kind of a golden age in New York agriculture. Instead of just doing this monoculture of wheat, farmers will move to higher value goods, ones that have kind of higher price margins, so they're not going to be outcompeted by these areas with better growing seasons. And they're more specialty goods, right? So Rochester, for instance, when their flour production stops being particularly profitable, they're going to innovate the way in commercial nurseries. So growing things like fruit trees, shrubs, and most notably flowers. Rochester's name will eventually become changed from the flower FLOUR city to the flower FLOWER city, which it still calls itself today. So this is actually a picture of a gladiolus farming operation here in Syracuse. But that's one of the things. You have every kind of Erie Canal town gets known as the X, Y, or Z capital of the world. Lyons is the peppermint capital of the world. Little Falls on Mohawk Valley becomes known as the cheese capital of the world. Dairy really takes off in Mohawk. The first ever cheese factory in America is built in Rome, New York. You've got Phelps as the sauerkraut capital of the world. Like I said, Syracuse is the salt city. This is a picture from Canastota. A lot of people think it's onions because that's what they are now most well known for. But before that, Canastota was famous for its extensive celery fields. So Canastota is this big celery town. Up here, this is a photo from our collection of folks, probably in southern Madison County is where we believe it was. They're producing a high value crop. Doesn't make food, it makes beverages primarily, which is hops. The counties of Otsego, Oneida, Madison, and Onondaga counties will make something around 80% of the nation's hops in the 1870s, producing at their peak 21 million pounds of hops. And these hop harvests are important times of the year, as is all harvests. You've got these big festivals, kind of major get-togethers for people and social events. A lot of people, meet their future husbands and wives at these sorts of things. The populations of the cities along the canal will decrease during these time periods, just as people move to these harvests, etc., because it's very lucrative. And in the 1870s, New York is the most agriculturally productive and agriculturally diverse state in the Union. However, it's not just farming that's happening. There are also people who, once that kind of early agricultural phase ends, start instead trying to innovate how we produce food, how food is, and help farmers farther west produce and ship their food. A notable thing that springs up along the canals are canneries. This is the famous Beechnut Cannery in Canajahari. They begin in the late 1800s, vacuum sealing hams, but their canning operations will expand rapidly, and food production in general. They're most notable for their beechnut gum and their baby food products, which still exist today. Here in Syracuse, you have the Merrill Sewell Canning Company. They actually own 12 different canneries located right on the banks of the canal. You can see the remains of one of those at the Chittenango Landing Canal Boat Museum. Merrill Sewell's most famous for none such mincemeat, but they're producing tons and tons of canned goods, which are great to put on a canal boat versus a railroad, because canned goods can stay fresh longer, so they can afford to take a couple extra days on a canal boat, so it's cheaper. Also, those hotels we talked about, they continue to grow as people keep moving along the canal. This is Clinton Square here in Syracuse. This is the Empire House, and its lower floor becomes kind of a world famous restaurant. They're well known, and most other major canal cities have these sorts of important things. Also, you've got people working in factories more. So the area is becoming more industrialized. You've got these canning companies. Over here, you've got this is the Syracuse Chilled Plow Company. This company produces a special type of plow that is great for kind of digging up the soil in the Great Plains area. So the Syracuse Chilled Plow is kind of one of the essential kind of next phase of agricultural innovations, where its unique plow is great for plowing up what's going to become America's new breadbasket, the Great Plains, right? And the Syracuse Chilled Plow Company is absolutely massive. It will eventually become a subsidiary of John Deere, but it's not too far away from the canal. And these kind of agricultural implements are made all along the canal. Down here, we have an iconic canal image. But also, you'll notice on the other bank of the canal, this is the factories of International Harvester. They've made a number of mechanical harvesters right here. The McCormick Reaper will first be successfully manufactured in Brockport, New York, right on the banks of the canal as well. But all these factories that are growing, those workers, back when you're a primarily agricultural society, most people would just kind of go home for lunch, eat their meal there, and return to work. But now if you're going into the city to work in one of these factories, now you don't really have that option anymore. So that is when we start to see, and also office buildings, we start to see the proliferation of things like restaurants and taverns and saloons, where you could get a meal midday or at the end of your work shift. Also, moving into work in a lot of these factories and these farms are a number of immigrants who bring with them their own unique food cultures. Up here in the top corner, we can see a number of German immigrants involved in the meat processing industry. They are working at the factory of A.C. Hoffman, who all of us Central New Yorkers know and love for their still famous German Franks. The Hoffman Sausage Company is originally founded by German immigrants. And they bring a lot of their own unique foods, and we're going to discuss that in a second. Down here, we see a notable Syracuse food and beverage producing industry. This is founded by an immigrant. This is the Greenways Brewing Company. It would be right across the street, right across Erie Boulevard from Niagara Mohawk building today. It's founded by English immigrant John Greenway in the 1850s. Also founded around the same time as the famous Haberle's Brewing Company, founded by a German immigrant on the north side, Benedict Haberle. And these are two competing styles of beer. You've also got, you can still see it in the diets of and the signature foods of all of upstate New York today. A large amount of Polish influence, Italian influence on food, etc. And some of the other Irish impact. And so let's look at a couple of those most iconic foods that we have. To talk about the first one, it relates to these German immigrants we're talking about. It also relates to another way that the Erie Canal transforms kind of American society. All these people moving up and down the canal, they're bringing with them new ideas, new thoughts. And you have what's called the Second Great Awakening first. It's this major religious movement where people start taking more personal responsibility in their moral choices. Well, that come a number of reform movements, notably the abolition movement, the women's rights movement, and importantly to this story, the temperance movement. So the movement to either personally consume less alcohol or ban it entirely. And over the decades, it gained steam And in the 1870s, laws actually passed in New York saying you can't order an alcoholic beverage without also ordering food. This is quite upsetting to bar owners. At the time, many of whom, especially those along the canal, are immigrants, especially in Buffalo's case, especially. So that this is important to note. Even today, we see immigrants are often marginalized to less desirable neighborhoods. That was the case in the 1800s as well. And the canal had grown a reputation. It's the smelly body of water. Canalers are kind of a rough and tumble bunch. So often we see immigrants living alongside the canal. In Buffalo, Germans lived canal side. So there's these German canal side tavern keepers. They hear about this new law that you have to buy alcohol to eat food. The hope was you'd buy less alcohol, right? Well, they thought they'd get back at those pesky politicians in Albany by producing a food using their kind of native knowledge from Germany to make a food substance that would make people actually want to drink more beer. And thus is born the beef on weck, the saltiest food product they could think of, with salty roast beef and the Kummelweck bun. Salt also plays a role in another important immigrant-inspired dish. And this story is a bit closer to home. That is the salt potato. First kind of created here in central New York, largely by Irish and German immigrants working boiling salt in Syracuse's salt fields. They'd toss their potatoes in, at lunchtime, wait for the salt, the brine to boil away. Thus would be left with those delicious salty treats that we still all know and love in upstate New York today. So yeah, we can see the impact of immigrants in a lot of ways on foodways. Also very relevant to right now, New York's not just focused on, growing crops and producing goods to help other people grow crops or transport crops, etc. They also want to stay at the cutting edge of agricultural and agricultural technology kind of progress. And thus is born what is now a central New York kind of icon, the New York State Fair. Begun in 1848, it's created by the New York State Agricultural Society with the hope of allowing farmers to learn more about what's best for growing crops, what crops are best to grow, what technology they can use. I mean, nowadays it's kind of no one really thinks about it when you go to the state fair a lot of times. Like, if you've got a blue ribbon winning cow, right? Who cares, really? Well, that's important because, you're awarding prizes to this cow because it can produce the most beef. It's the best, strongest kind of steer you've got. I don't know anything about cows, so forgive me, or bovines. I have been yelled at before for my liberal use of cow to describe various bovine animals. Anyway, though, so the hope is you identify what the best cow is, the best chicken is, the best goat in New York State. Those breed with all the other cows, goats, and etc. And you've got a stronger stock for the state. And New York agriculture proves. Also, we have here a postcard from the fair showing a tractor demonstration. So you could see who had the best tractors available for purchase. Also, consumers could go and learn about new food products. This is an advertisement from the fairgrounds for a new type of pancake flour. So the fair is helping to spur food-based innovation. Also, you've got schools like Cornell that are founded in part to help advance the science of agriculture. I mean, the Cornell Ag School today is still one of the premier agricultural schools in the country. And we still see today that the fair still has lots of connections to food. So now it's to see which thing you can deep fry the most. But yeah, so that's the fair. However, the Erie Canal starts to see a decline in business around the late 1800s, and we see in this picture why. That is the New York Central Railroad, largely running parallel to the canal in a lot of ways, and there's more and more railroads crisscrossing the country as well. And railroads, they've got a lot of advantages over a canal boat. They're faster. They don't have to wait for locks. They can carry more goods eventually as engine technology improves. They don't have to close in the wintertime like the canal did when it froze over. So they're just more efficient. And eventually they start outcompeting the canal. By the 1890s, New York's trying to figure out what to do with its canal system. It's pretty apparent that it can't keep up with the railroads anymore. There are some thoughts of closing it. However, food again plays an important role. Again, grain and flour shipping. Now, flour milling had not completely ended in New York. It just had stopped being important in Rochester. In fact, much of America's grain milling was still done in Buffalo, New York, because all of that wheat that's being produced in the Great Lakes Basin, it still had to get to places like New York City to be shipped. And to do that, you had to take the canal or the New York Central from Buffalo. So a lot of grain is unloaded in Buffalo. You can still see the remnants of that industry today in Silo City in Buffalo. And I mean, they still have the big General Mills factory, et cetera. Anyway, those flour merchants in Buffalo and also flour merchants in New York City, because they're the next big transshipment point for flour, they're worried that if the canal closes down, they've got no other option than to ship their goods via the New York Central Railroad. So you have a monopoly, and monopolies, when they are formed, can then charge you whatever amount they want. So they're really worried that there's not going to be this public option of a canal with possibly cheaper transportation routes competing against the monopoly or against the railroad. They successfully lobby and create a good campaign. They also work with then Governor Teddy Roosevelt, who loves himself a good canal always, to expand the Erie Canal. In 1905, they will begin construction of the barge canal, completed in 1918, and it will serve its job in the 1930s. It's going to be moving upwards of 20 million tons of flour and wheat on the barge canal annually, as well as other food products. My favorite is a shipment of eels from Oswego to New York City. You can still see, in a lot of ways, the remains of this industry throughout New York. Notably, in Gowanus Bay in Brooklyn, they have these absolutely massive grain silos that were built specifically to take in Erie Canal grain shipments. Okay, perfect. After World War II, though, the importance of the barge canal begins to subside, especially after 1959. The St. Lawrence Seaway is opened. Following the war, you've got kind of a fully integrated transportation network throughout America. You've got railroads crisscrossing the entire country. Soon you're going to have the interstate highway system as well. And the transportation advantage you have gained by the Erie Canal has kind of dried up. And really, transportation advantages almost anywhere kind of dry up, unless you're kind of maybe in the middle of the country. Companies start to expand, grow larger. We now have new technology like refrigeration and pasteurization etc., that make it so, things like TV dinners start to exist. Food becomes more homogenized over the years. And this is seen as, a great thing in kind of like the 50s and stuff. Our new kind of space age, like, look, everyone can eat the same thing. Isn't that great? However, starting in the 60s and 70s, you start seeing some pushback against this. You begin to have people questioning, like, hey, what's going into my food? What's going onto my food? Where is it coming from? And we see new trends in food world of things like the farm to table movement, also vegetarianism, veganism, opposition to things like genetically modified organisms. You see environmental folks, DDT is a great insecticide, but it also kills everything else around it too, and those start to become banned, etc. You start seeing people the back to the land movement as well. People start taking an interest in where their food comes from, and agro-tourism starts to grow as well. Also, you've got whole new segments of immigrants moving into the canal corridor at this time, who are also bringing along their own unique food culture. And you can see the stamp of all of these movements here in Syracuse to this very day. I'd like to use it kind of as a case study of current foodways along the canal. You've got the Evergreen restaurant, is great. Highly suggest going to it if you can. They are in the oldest building in Syracuse, a former canal side warehouse. They've repurposed it, and their restaurant has mostly locally sourced ingredients. They have a number of these vegetarian. They also, so full disclosure, I have an entire presentation on alcohol and how it was impacted by the canal. So like the craft beer industry is part of the same thing. They have tons of craft beers on tap. And then we have, about a block away from it right now, the Salt City Market recently opened in 2021. It shows the still incredibly rich and diverse food scene of Syracuse and how it's been impacted kind of in the last 50 or so years by new waves of immigrants. They've got, just in this picture alone, I can see a Middle Eastern restaurant, Vietnamese, Burmese, and a soul food restaurant, Miss Prissy's. They have, I believe, 12 different vendors here, largely run by locals and either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants at a number of these different restaurants. So it's great. You can see the way this is all evolving. I had a really cool, I got to interview for this a farm out in Holly, New York. They actually use barge canal water to irrigate their crops on their orchard, herd orchards. And they talked about the impact. Immigrants are still essential in production of crops along the canal corridor today, as well as they always have been. You've got Central American immigrants, but also importantly, they mentioned Burmese immigrants were essential for their operations. And I'm glad to see Big in Burma here, which is Syracuse's first Burmese restaurant. So we see that canal corridor foodways continue to evolve. Also down here, we collaborated recently with Talking Cursive Brewing Company, which is on the site of that former Greenways brewery, to make our own kind of canal-inspired beer.